Things were not looking well for the Allied powers by 1917. The German army still occupied most of Belgium and the industrial sections of northern France. Attempts to defeat the Ottoman Turks resulted in disaster for British forces in Turkey, and in Russia the Empire of the Romanovs was coming to a sad and tragic conclusion as the Tsar's armies endured defeat after defeat after defeat, and a native son would be sent in from exile and take over the Russian state. On the Western Front, futile attacks still mired in the tradition of Napoleon withered under the modern technology of barbed wire, the machine gun, massive artillery, and poison gas. Reminiscent of the American Civil War Battle of the Crater in 1864, British, French, and German units tunneled under each other's lines, oftentimes fighting underground, and then packed massive explosives that atomized human bodies when exploded. The fields of no man's land featured grotesque smells and livid pools in which corpses floated, in contrast to the blooming of flowers caused by the saturation of fields with nitrates from artillery explosions. Into all of this strode the reluctant warrior, the man in the picture there, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, simply known as Woodrow Wilson, 27th President of the United States. Having tried to keep America out of the war for 2.5 years, he called for war with Germany after the Kaiser's military advisors, the ones really running the country, decided on a course of action to try and knock the French and British out of the war, although they knew it would bring in the Americans. The Western Front stretched from the Alps all the way to the North Sea, but it was hardly a straight or smooth line. Rather, it bulged in several places, and these bulges were called salients and provided numerous difficulties to either force because they disrupted communications and provided points at which the line could be broken. The first of these great salients was along the Somme River in northwestern France. The Somme offensive commenced on July the 1st and lasted all the way until November the 18th, 1916. This came about as a result of the Allied powers finally agreeing to coordinate their attacks. The Somme offensive involved 3 million men who attempted to push back the Germans. Although the British and French initially had some gains and pushed the Germans back 6 miles, the French had to divert their reserves and leave the heavy lifting to the British. All sides suffered horrendous casualties in the area of 400,000 to 1 million. In one day, the British suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 killed. That's the worst day in the history of the British Army. The British High Command called it the Great Push Forward. The British soldiers on the ground called it the Great Fuck Up. One of the reasons why the French faltered in their support and had to withdraw some of their resources from the Somme was another great battle had erupted around the town of Verdun on the Meuse River. The Battle of Verdun ranged from February the 21st until December the 18th, 1916, which at 302 days made it the longest battle of the First World War. In the first 3 days of the battle, the Germans captured Fort Douaumont. The battle became one of attrition, though, as German General Falkenhayn told the Kaiser the real objective was to bleed the French white. The problem was that the Germans suffered nearly as much. Both sides suffered almost 800,000 casualties and cost France the flower of its youth. The third great battle along the Western Front is the Battle of Ypres. It's pronounced Ypres, although the British called it the Battle of Wipers. It was a series of 3 battles in 1914, 1915, and 1917. The third battle, the Battle of Passchendaele, was fought July the 31st through November the 6th, 1917. This is in the region of Flanders. This is fought in Belgium. There you see the cotton factory in Belgium on fire in Ypres. Another 400,000 men would be lost. Here you see a map of the Western Front. You see Paris. Now you see at the top center the battlefield of Ypres and the Somme and Verdun, and of course the Marne River, which was where the miracle happened in 1914, and then there would be a second battle at the Marne River later on. Even in black and white, you can see the great misery that the soldiers had in the trenches. These are French soldiers in the trenches near Verdun. This is a photograph of the Verdun battlefield in 2005. Now you do the math on that. That's almost a whole century since the battle, and still the craters are there, filled up with water. And the trees have only started to grow back in this particular area. The Battle of Verdun is famous for the French general Robert Nivelle saying, "They shall not pass." It was a moment of French gallantry to hold the Germans off. Of course, the French were also saying every time that Nivelle said, "They shall not pass," and the French would say, "And neither shall we." I'm only going to do one piece of art in this whole lesson here, and that is Verdun, Tableau de Guerre. Verdun, the scene of war, 1917. This is by Félix Vallotton. As the battles along the Western Front raged, there were elements in both Whitehall and in Paris that advocated attacks on the Ottomans to force the passage of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, the two straits that went from the Aegean Sea into the Black Sea. This would bring relief to Russia, protect the Suez Canal, and divert German forces from the Western Front. Now, one of the champions of the Gallipoli campaign was British First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill. From February 17, 1915 to January the 9th, 1916, forces from Australia and New Zealand, the famous Anzacs, failed in their attempts to take the peninsula and Constantinople. A 1981 movie called Gallipoli stars a young actor named Mel Gibson for the first time, and it tells the story of what happened at Gallipoli. The failure at Gallipoli would cost Churchill his position as First Lord of the Admiralty. He would then go to the front and serve with his old regiment, and then he came back to the cabinet later as Minister of Munitions. On the Italian front, the Battle of Caporetto raged along the Isonzo River between Italy and the Austrian forces. Italy had been part of the Central Powers since 1882, but then changed sides in 1915 as a result of one of the many secret treaties that existed at the time. They had signed a treaty with France promising them that they would get some regions of Austria in the Tyrolean Alps if they joined the Allied cause. The battles in northern Italy was often fought at high latitudes. This is the Alps after all, and in freezing weather, and this always favored the defenders. The Battle of Caporetto was fought from October the 24th until November the 19th, 1917. The battle was a disaster for the Second Italian Army. German units reinforced the Austrians. They used infiltration tactics and poison gas and drove the Italians all the way back to the Piave River and within reach of Venice. At this point, the Italians rallied under their new commanders, Armando Diaz of General Diaz Street in Lakeview fame. The invasion actually reinvigorated the patriotism of the Italians, who rallied with new draftees and greater support for the war. Back in France, the Nivelle offensives continued the same futility that had existed along the Western Front. But this time, the French soldiers responded to this disaster in a different way. From April 16th to May 9th, 1917, General Robert Nivelle conducted an offensive that he predicted would shatter the Germans in 48 hours. He predicted that his creeping military artillery barrage, which means that you roll the barrage in front of the infantry as it advanced, would punch a hole in the German lines. This all raised the morale of the troops. Now, planning is one thing, though, and execution is another. The artillery proved to be ineffective. The Germans were just too well dug in. and the charges against the German positions were futile. The French lost another 187,000 casualties. At one point during the battle, the French got out of their trenches and started walking toward the German trenches to attack, and they started making the noise of sheep, bah, bah, like sheep being led to the slaughter. The battle ignited French mutinies throughout the ranks. Although they were not mutinies in the strictest sense of the word, soldiers remained in the trenches and were willing to defend them, but they rejected attack orders. This was in part due to the pacifism stimulated by the Russian Revolution and the trade union movement. In addition, this is after the Americans had come into the war, and the desire was to wait for the Americans. Nivelle was the one who was shattered by this. He was sacked. He was sent to North Africa to sit out the rest of the war. The new commander, General Henri-Philippe Pétain, restored morale by talking to the men, promising no more suicidal attacks. He provided rest for exhausted units. He gave home leave to many soldiers. He gave some moderate discipline, though. He held 3,400 courts-martial. 554 mutineers were sentenced to death. Many of them were officers who got drunk during the battle and simply wouldn't leave. But only 26 were actually executed. Pétain is considered to be a hero of Verdun, and he is also the hero of the French troops. But Pétain showed something of his character. Something of a defeatist nature had entered into Pétain, and this defeatist nature would hurt him later on in his life. The mutinies of the French army provide part of the backdrop for Stanley Kubrick's great film starring Kirk Douglas, titled Paths of Glory. Here you see a map of where Gallipoli is in the Gallipoli campaign. There you see, of course, my favorite city in all the maps that I give you, Constantinople, which very shortly is going to be renamed Istanbul. The Dardanelles is the strait that leads from the Aegean Sea up into the Sea of Marmara and then Constantinople. And the cape at the end of the Dardanelles is called Cape Helles, and this is where the Australian and New Zealanders would land and try to attack and move up, but it was a very rocky, mountainous cape and very difficult. Wars are interesting to study in notes and in maps, but it's the photographs of war that really bring home what war is all about. Here's a photograph of Greek children standing by the bones of soldiers who died during the Gallipoli campaign. They've collected these bones on Hill 60, Anzac Cove in 1919. Many Australians and New Zealanders regard the Gallipoli campaign as the beginning of their national consciousness, where they really separated themselves from the British Empire once and for all, even though they remained part of the British Commonwealth. This led to their national unification in Australia and the declaration of the country of Australia and the country of New Zealand. Here you see where the Battle of Caporetto took place. At the time, it was not even in Italy, and even to this day, it's not in Italy. It's in the country of Slovenia. It's called Kobana. There you see Venice, and the blue lines, the more northern of the blue lines is the front, and then the southern blue line is where the front stabilized, right near Venice. This is part of the battlefield of Caporetto today. You can see how high into the Alps that it is located. Two very interesting figures emerged from the Battle of Caporetto. On the left is a newspaper columnist by the name of Benito Mussolini. His newspaper columns rallied the Italians after the disaster at Caporetto. On the right is 26-year-old Lieutenant Erwin Rommel, who fought at Caporetto and was awarded the Pour le Mérite for his actions on the Italian front. He became a master at analyzing military tactics and developing his own. A young Italian priest by the name of Father Angelo Roncalli would serve as a sergeant in the Italian Army Medical Corps as a stretcher bearer at Caporetto and along the Piave River. He would later become Pope John XXIII. One time when he was Pope, he greeted an archbishop who had been his superior officer on the front, and in typical Pope John the 23rd fashion, in his papal regalia, he saluted the archbishop and said, "Sergeant Roncalli reporting for service, sir." Now here is another look at the map of the First World War in Europe with Verdun that you see there, and then you'll see the Somme, and then you followed by Caporetto, and finally Gallipoli. It's important to know where these things happen. You see where the Eastern Front is located, the Western Front, the Italian Front. There are many fronts in Europe that this war is fought. The main action is the Eastern and Western fronts, and most of the actions on the Western Front. On the left is General Robert Nivelle. On the right is Field Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain. Another photograph of war as two French soldiers tried to navigate a swamp in no man's land in a former forest near Verdun. I don't know if you all have seen the Netflix movie, The Two Popes, but of course that features Pope Francis, the current Pope, and Pope Benedict XVI. Well, in order to have a Pope Benedict XVI, you had to have a Pope Benedict XV, and he was the Pope during the First World War. The Pope made a peace offer in 1917 that contained numerous points to try and bring Europe back to peace. He considered the war a suicide of civilized Europe. His plan was rejected by the Germans because the Protestants in there did not want to have a papal peace plan. The French also rejected it because the Pope had shown quite a bit of favoritism toward the Central Powers during the war. Well, then the Pope turned his attention to POWs and bringing humanitarian relief. He also focused on the impact of the war on the foreign missions, and most importantly, the problem of Russian communism. On the Eastern Front, despite the presence of the Tsar, the Russians continued to lose and lose and lose. They were hindered by the lack of a developed industrial base and a poor military leadership. They had now lost Poland, and German troops were now marching into the Baltic states and Ukraine. At the same time, a new revolution, stoked by Lenin and a number of other Marxists, engulfed the country, as the Empress could not govern the country in the absence of the Tsar. Eventually, mass demonstrations, orchestrated both from within the country and without, led Nicholas to abdicate his throne in favor of a provisional government. The provisional government was weak, though, and could not bring order to the deteriorating military situation. And eventually it would be overthrown by a second revolution that installed Lenin as master of Russia. At first, the Bolsheviks thought about continuing the war, but soon Lenin decided the political struggle was more important. So he yielded, authorized the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which took Russia out of the war completely. What this did was free several 100,000 German troops, which the Kaiser and his commanders, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the real leaders of Germany at this point, transferred to the Western Front, ready to smash France. However, remember the ominous warning of Nietzsche. If you look into the abyss too long, sometimes the abyss looks into you. Russia had been defeated militarily, but Leninist philosophy and doctrine were alive and well. And the German soldiers who remained in Russia, far too many of them, were right in the middle of that doctrine. This map shows the farthest extent and reaches of German troops into Russia prior to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was signed in 1918. Almost all of the Ukraine, portions of the Baltic states, Belarus, and of course Poland were now occupied by the Kaiser's armies. A continent and an ocean removed from Russia and the Western Front, the people of the United States watched the goings-on in Europe with a mixture of arrogant aloofness, but also anxiety that it might touch its shores. A little over a century earlier, George Washington warned Americans to stay out of the European propensity for treaties and intrigue. But the world was much smaller by 1917. For Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States at that time, the thought of entering the war was at first a non-starter. He was part of the great progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Therefore, he advocated world peace as a solution to the buildup of militaries that deprived countries of much needed wealth for social services. When the Lusitania went down off the coast of Ireland with 128 Americans on board in 1915, war hawks like former President Theodore Roosevelt clamored for an aggressive reply. But Wilson declared that there is such a thing as a nation too proud to fight. Woodrow Wilson was a child of the South, who then moved to New Jersey, where he joined the Department of History at Princeton and then served as president of the university before becoming elected governor of the state in 1910, and then being elected to the White House in 1912. He was raised in a strict Calvinist upbringing. This made him very strident in his views. He was also a white supremacist. He had resegregated Washington, D.C., and allowed D.W. Griffith to screen his movie, Birth of a Nation, that gave blessing to the KKK and white supremacy. Wilson had avoided war for 2.5 years. He had been elected by accident, really, capitalizing on a major division in the Republican Party to eke out a win in 1912 over Roosevelt and incumbent William Howard Taft. When he was up for re-election again in 1916, his slogan was, "He kept us out of the war." He won, and then 6 months later, he brought the U.S. into the war. He attempted to negotiate a settlement for much the same way that Roosevelt had negotiated the end of the war between Russia and Japan a decade earlier. However, for a variety of reasons, he believed America must soon enter the war on the side of the Allies. He had to go slow, however, because there was an overwhelming sentiment for neutrality in the United States. The large number of Irish Americans living in the country harbored a great deal of anti-British sentiment, and Britain was not yet quite in the special relationship category the U.S. enjoys with it today. In addition, there were a large number of German Americans who were anti-Russia and did not want to see the U.S. fight against their ethnic homeland. Germany, though, tipped the scale against themselves in 1917 and brought in the United States on its own. The problem for the Germans and the Austrians by 1917 is that they had taken so many soldiers for their armies. Many of these soldiers came from farms, and that meant food production dropped to near starvation levels. The British blockade at first did not matter much to Germany or Austria because their nations were breadbaskets. But by 1917, Austria was now on the verge of collapse, and the Germans were eating dogs and even rats as they had to dim the lights at various times just to save energy. In 1916, the old emperor, Franz Joseph, who had ruled since 1848, had given up the ghost and passed away after a 68-year rule. His grandnephew Karl inherited the throne. The Austrian military was so devoid of direction that they submitted themselves to the German High Command. And it was the German High Command that now ruled Germany, not the Kaiser. To at least deal blow for blow the British for their blockade, they announced that German U-boats would renew unrestricted submarine warfare, which they knew would bring the Americans into the war. Once again, all ships on their way to Britain were fair game, according to the Germans. The straw that broke the camel's back for the United States came on February the 19th, 1917, when British intelligence intercepted a telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Heinrich von Eckart, the German ambassador to Mexico. The telegram told the ambassador to encourage the Mexicans to join in an alliance and occupy U.S. forces on the border. Then the Germans would help the Mexicans recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which had been taken from Mexico in 1848. Now, there was no shot in hell that the Germans, even if they won in Europe, could give back the southwest U.S. to Mexico. But as long as the Mexicans might believe it, then why not try? The main goal was to delay the Americans so the Germans could defeat both the Brits and the French. When the British intercepted the telegram, they immediately gave it to Wilson. And when the telegram became public, American sentiment immediately flared in favor of war, especially when William Randolph Hearst, the great yellow journalist, and his newspapers started fanning the flames. And Zimmerman himself then confirmed it. Wilson then delivered his war message to Congress on April 2, 1917, in which he called for a war to end all wars. Congress declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, by a vote of 82 to 6 in the Senate with 8 abstentions, while the House voted 373 to 50 in favor of war. Among those 50 was Jeannette Rankin, representative from Montana of the Republican Party. She was the first woman ever elected to the U.S. Congress, and later the only vote against war with Japan in 1941. Wilson declared that the United States would be an associated power, in that it was seeking to fight on the side of Britain and France, but it was not in the war for territorial gain, and only to end the war and bring a lasting peace. War fever throughout the United States broke out. Patriotic parades, predictions of great victory were made for the U.S. But the American military and naval forces were woefully unprepared. The U.S. population was averse to standing armies, and most of the U.S. military was out in the West or along the Mexican border. And so, using the first true selective service system, the United States drafted 2.8 million men, and more than 4 million enlisted in the armed services. And this created what became known as the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. It was placed under the command of General John Joseph Pershing. Pershing demanded that his troops be absolutely well trained, which meant that few troops arrived in Europe before January of 1918. However, he did send the Marines because the Marines are always ready. The U.S. Navy sailed to the British port of Scapa Flow, which is up on the north of Britain, to join the Navy in operations on the Atlantic, guarding convoys. Pershing and his staff went to France. They arrived on July the 5th, 1917. Before even meeting with the French commanders, the first place Pershing and his staff visited, once they arrived in Paris, was the tomb of Marie-Paul-Yves Roch-Guibert de Montgolfier, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was the 19-year-old hero of the Revolutionary War, who had been George Washington's closest foreign advisor. He was also a hero in France, having taken charge of Paris after the burning of the Bastille. And then he wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen with the help of his friend Thomas Jefferson. He survived the Revolution. He survived an Austrian prison. He declined to serve Napoleon, opposed the Bourbons, and then supported and then later opposed Louis Philippe. He toured the United States in 1824 to a rapturous welcome. He died on May 20th, 1834, and is buried in Picpus Cemetery in Paris. Sprinkled on top of his grave was soil from Bunker Hill. He is sometimes known as the hero of the two worlds for his accomplishments in the service of both France and the United States. Those that visited that day were not fewer than 200 men. They were led by General Pershing. They were the first American military force to ever reach the continent of Europe. The United States entered World War I for many reasons, but this rationale was often framed within the context of supporting friends, such as France, who had come to America's aid at a time of great need. This sentiment is reflected in the words of an American Lieutenant Colonel, Charles Stanton, following a parade through Paris amidst the enthusiastic and welcoming embrace of the French. Pershing, Stanton, and the American troops arrived at the grave of the Marquis. Though the words are often incorrectly attributed to the better-known Pershing, it was Stanton who then said the ultimate returned the favor quote, "Nous voilà, Lafayette," which translates, "Lafayette, we are here." Pershing was given a very wide latitude to handle the military affairs of the First World War for the American Expeditionary Force. Therefore, Woodrow Wilson turned his attention to crafting a plan for peace. And what emerged was the 14 points. The 14 points are the product of the work of Wilson's very close advisor, Edwin Mandell House, often called Colonel House, although he never served in the military. House came from Texas. He was a white supremacist, very much involved in trying to bring Reconstruction to an end before he left and went to Washington and got involved in national politics and helped his friend Wilson win the White House in 1912. Wilson put together a team that House headed, and it was called the Inquiry. This was a group of academics that put together all the information and knowledge necessary to understand the situation with every European country, every European military, and create a lasting peace. When Wilson addressed a joint congressional session on January the 8th, 1918, he offered what came to be known as the 14 points. It was his plan for peace. In part, this was a reaction to secret treaties among the various European nations. The Bolsheviks had actually exposed this with all the rifling through the Tsar's papers. It was also a direct response to Lenin's decree on peace. Wilson, of course, had no use for the godless Bolsheviks. The 14 points were greeted with skepticism and resentment by the Allies, who had not been consulted prior to the speech. In fact, Clemenceau at one point railed on, "Wilson and his 14 points, Wilson and his 14 points." God had only 10. However, the Central Powers looked to Wilson as the chief negotiator for an armistice. All 14 of the 14 points are very important and should be understood, but it is the first two and the 14th that are the ones that one should really concentrate upon. The very first point is that no more secret treaties, open covenants of peace, and an end to private or secret treaties. It had been clearly identified that the secret treaties had been in part the cause of this war. From now on, if nations made agreements, it would be done in the open with absolute transparency. Secondly, freedom of the seas. This, of course, made the British and David Lloyd George say, "I say, wait just quite a moment there." The British, of course, had the largest navy in the world and dominated the open seas. They were not all that thrilled with this, but Wilson said, freedom of the seas must be maintained. You go down through the rest of it: open trade, national disarmament, colonial disputes resolved, the evacuation of Russia, the evacuation and restoration of Belgium, the evacuation and restoration of all French territory by foreign powers, the holding up of Italy's borders, autonomy for the peoples of Austria-Hungary. That means that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be broke up. Everybody's going to get out of the Balkans, leave those nations to determine their own fate. Turkey must be recognized as sovereign and independent, and the Dardanelles, over which the Gallipoli campaign had been fought, must be open to shipping. Poland, which had been dissolved back in the 1790s, now at last has to be restored to independence and has to be given access to the sea. And it is this last one, the product of the great progressive movement of the 19th and 20th century, the establishment of a League of Nations, so that nations would have a forum in which to work out its differences without resorting to war. This is the plan for peace that Wilson would propose. This is the plan for peace that the Central Powers now began to seek their way out of this terrible war.